Hello, in part 1 we covered the basics of Houdini Animation Editor, and in this video we are going to take a look through the rest of the tools. So here we have an animated character with keyframes and animation already done. We can see that there are a lot of controls for this character, and if we select the character, we can see that there are a lot of controls here, and it's kind of a mess here in the graph view. We can select individual controls, but sometimes we want to quickly select all the leg controls, all the spine controls, and so on. And this is where the channel groups come in. We can have channel groups displayed in the animation editor here, other tools, and we select channel groups, or we can have them in the separate panel here, in the channel list panel, and have them displayed here. I personally prefer to have them in the separate panel to keep only the channel list in the animation editor to keep things a bit cleaner. But basically they are the same thing, so whatever we select here in the channel list, it will be selected in the animation editor as well. So channel groups, as the name implies, allows us to create groups of different channels, and this is very useful when we have a character like Kyo here. We can have a group for all controls, for instance, and then a group for the arm, a group for the fingers, and so on. The way to create channel groups, we can just right-click in the channel groups and create empty group, or we can select here any channel, and we can create group from all channels, which would create the group from all channels here, or from selected channels if you only want to create the group from the channels we selected. So for now, let's say that we want to select a group that will include all the spine controls here. So I'm gonna select all this and just create group from all channels, name it spine. And what I can also do is create an empty group, name it Kyo, which is the name of the character, and simply drag spine onto Kyo group and move group into Kyo. And basically I'm building a hierarchy for channel groups. Okay, so now if I click on this spine group, I will have displayed all the spine controls here. So let's do another one for instance, for his right arm. Just name it right arm, and again move it under Kyo group. And we could do this for the whole character. For instance, we could just select all the facial controls and just create a group based on that, so that we can quickly modify for all the controls of the face. So and now we can individually edit the controls in the channels in each channel group. For instance, we can now separately modify the timing or the keyframe for the right arm, for instance, or we can just change the spine timing. So this is a nice way to isolate different regions of the character. And if we select the parent group, all the subgroups channels will be selected. And this can be very useful with a character like Kyo here, for instance, when we wish to edit all the character keyframes at the same time. And notice the two little icons here beside the channel names. And these two icons, the first one is a pin icon, and we'll look at pinning later when we get to the channel list. And the second one is a keyframe icon. And this icon, basically, if you press it, it will set the keyframe on all channels in this channel group. And if there is a key already there on these channels, when we press it, it will delete that key. So basically, it toggles the keyframe. If we click, if there is no keyframe, it will set it. If there's a keyframe, it will delete it. Also, one important thing is that if the channel group is selected, the channels in the group will always be displayed in the channel list, no matter the viewport selection. So the channels displayed from viewport selection are only added to the channel group's channel list. So if you're seeing channels in the channel list and you don't know why, check whether or not any channel group is selected. So for instance, here we have the right arm channel group selected. And if we click on the center of gravity control, it has only been added to the channel list. So channel groups are really useful, and I really like using them a lot, as I found that it speeds up the workflow quite a lot. I usually set channel groups for the whole character when setting up the scene. And when I'm blocking, I just pose the character at the desired frame, press the keyframe button for the whole character, and I know everything has been properly keyframed. And I don't have to worry whether or not I have selected all the controls or not. Now let's take a closer look at the channel list. So we mentioned pinning already here previously for the channel groups, and we also have pins here for each individual channel. And we can pin the channel by clicking here on the pin icon for each individual channel, or clicking here for all channels. And what pinning does is basically, if we deselect the control, the pinned channel will stay in the channel list. So if we select another control, those two channels that we pinned will always be displayed. And if we pin, for instance, right arm, we see that all the channels in the right arm channel group are displayed, even though the group is not selected and nothing is selected in the viewport. And now if you select the control, again, the control parameters will be only added to the channel list. And this is basically what pinning does. It retains the pinned channels in the channel list, no matter the viewport or any other selection. And one feature that can be extremely useful is channel filter. And channel filter basically filters what is displayed here in the channel list. So let's select the spine channels, and let's say that you want to display only the rotates. What you can do is, down here we have three icons, and the first one is for filtering translates, the second one is for rotates, and the last one for scales. And if we click on rotates, for instance, it will limit to display only rotates, and the same for translates and scales. And we can also manually enter here the name, and for instance in this case enter twist, and it will only display the twist channels. So this is extremely useful when dealing with large number of channels, as it easily filters whatever channel you want to work on. And in addition to filtering, we can also isolate channels in the channel list. So if you select, for instance, the elbow rotate X and press I, it will isolate this channel in the channel list. And one useful feature is changing multiple parameter values at the same time. So let's select spine here again and filter just the rotates, maybe just rotate X. And if you want to change, for instance, for let's say spine 3, 4, and 1, we can just click and drag and add control click on the 1. So we have 3 channels selected, and then with middle mouse button, click and drag to change the values of multiple channels at the same time. Okay, now it's time to look at animation layers. Animation layers can be really useful because we can add additional animation on top of existing animation and have separate animation curves. So the original animation curves stay clean this way. For instance, sometimes you want something to slowly rotate, but at the same time have jittery motion on top, for example. And this is where animation layers are really nice. So let's create a quick animation layer example. Right now we are happy with the whole animation this character has, but we would want to add an eye blink somewhere, and we like have an option to later move it in the timeline. And since currently all the keyframes for the eyelids have been already set up, so in this way we would have to collapse and edit the whole animation. However, if we add blink to a separate layer, the original layer can stay intact, and all we need to do is create an additional layer on top that will only have the blink animation. And this way we'll have two separate animation layers for the eyelids, and we will also very easily remove the eye blinks if they don't work and have the original animation intact. First, let's just create a separate channel group just for the blinks. So create group from channels, say eye blinks, kill. Okay, then let's go to animation layers and choose create layer mixer from channels. And let's name this one the eye blinks mixer. And this will create a chop network here at the object level, because we name it any chop, and here we have an eyelid mixer. So let's just go here to see. So any chop, and here is basically a chop network that is responsible for mixing of all these layers. Okay. Now the base layer that was created here contains the base animation that was already there, and this one we want to leave as it is. We want to create additional layer on top of that one. To do that, we click the bottom gear icon here and say add layer to layer mixer, and this will create an additional layer, and we will name it. We just right click and rename layer and name it blinks. And now we can start editing keys for the blinks layer. So now here in the channel list we see that the keyframes are gone for our parameters because we are in the blinks layer and no keys can be set into this layer. If we change to base, we see the original curves that we can edit. So we go back to blinks and we can start adding keys to this new empty layer. So we'll add one keyframe here, 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 and just go. So let's see how this goes. Okay, so there's a blink there. Let's create a little offset animation. Okay, so now we have an eye blink here. And because we have this on a separate layer, we can now easily drag left and right in the timeline and decide where exactly we want this blink to happen. So for instance, we can just move it forward and it will happen later, and we don't have to edit the original keyframes or anything because all this is now on a separate layer. Okay. So there's also this value here, and this value tells how much this is this layer affecting the animation. So if we say its value of 0, then this animation of this layer is not affecting the actual animation. So right now it's keyframed. So if I set the value to all keyframes to 0, it won't affect the original animation. What we can also do to disable the layer is simply clicking on this mute icon, and this will completely disable the layer. And then we have the solo icon, and what the solo option does is it disables all other layers. Basically, we are isolating the animation of just a single layer that has the solo enabled, and this can be useful when we are dealing with a lot of layers and we want to just see the animation of a single layer. Okay, now let's look at how to cycle animation and how to set the animation curve before the first and the last keyframe. So if you look at this character's animation and we look at, for instance, spine, center of gravity, Y controls, notice that we only have keyframe set to 21st frame, and the character is cycling afterwards. So these are the keyframes, and the curve is then repeating its motion. So the animation is cycling because we have keyframe extrapolation, which tells how to evaluate channels before the first and the last keyframe. And this is done by, for instance, we can select these keyframes and right-click on the parameter, channels, extrapolation, and here we can set it, for instance, to default, and it will set before and after the last keyframe, we change it to default. If we change these channels to cycle, it will cycle. And we can also change independently before and after. So for instance, if we changed after the last segment to slope, for instance, it will only change after the last keyframe. And if we change the extrapolation before the first segment to default, it will change before the first segment. So, and another way to do this is if we go to right click and go into channels and channel properties. Here we can also change this, for instance, to after and change it to cycle or to default and then back to cycle. We can, here in the channel properties, we can also change, for instance, things such as channel colors as well. And we can also change such things as auto scope and auto select flex as well. Okay, so now let's edit values here like we did before, but let's say we want to amplify this translate Y movement in the up and down. And we can select keys and move them up, or select all the keys and use the box like we did before and do each side up and down independently. But there's also, we could also use the pivot box, which is this one here. This one is scaling from the pivot position, which means that if we scale up, it will scale also down. So this is great when we want to amplify things. So it scales from the pivot, and if we move pivot, for instance, up here and scale down, everything is scaling from this pivot position. So this can be useful, for instance, when we want to scale from, for instance, read time and set it to specific frame, then we are scaling from that time. But most useful is I found for amplifying certain movements that are, in this case, like this up and down movement of the character. So while we are at the toolbar, let's check the rest of the tools. So the tying and untying handles we already did in the previous video. And we are also tangent types and selecting the slopes. But here we have one interesting function, and this is tie and untie values. So what is tie and untie values? Basically, it allows us to break the slope or graph of a curve instantly. And this might be useful in cases like object space switching, when we need to change values instantly when we change the space in which the object is animated. So let me demonstrate this on this curve, for instance. So we select the key and click the untie values button. And notice that right now here we have these two yellow boxes. And now if you move one up and the other one down, as you can see, the graph is basically, we broke the graph at a specific point. So this can be sometimes useful to avoid having multiple keys, and the change is very at the same time. So we are not having multiple keyframe set. And when we want to tie back, we just click this icon, tie values, and we are back at having only one value for this keyframe. And then we have the right display toolbar and these framing icons we already looked. And then we have the toggle normalized values display, and this one helps when we're working on multiple curves. And depending on the option we set by right-clicking on the toggle normalized display, it will normalize curves in the graph view. Without the normalization, the curves would be displayed as their values would dictate, and some have high values, like rotations can go up to 360, and there are some parameters that only have a value of 0 to 1. And this can be problematic in the graph view, as those parameters with lower values are hard to read. And this is when normalization comes in, as it normalizes all those values, so it's easier to read them in the graph view. So all parameters are normalized in the 0 to 1 range, and we can right-click and choose how these values are normalized. For character animation, I usually have this option turned on. And the next one is the multi-graph display mode. And this one allows, for instance, let's select 3 curves. And right now, all the curves are, for instance, we see that this translate Z is overlapping with other curves. When we enable the multi-graph mode, we basically stack all the selected curves. And here we decide how many graphs we can display at each time. And basically this multi-graph display prevents the overlapping of animation curves display in the graph view. And this can be sometimes useful when we want to edit multiple curves and see each one separately. Okay, moving on. So here we have options how the curves and keys and handles are displayed. So the first one will hide handles. The second one will show tangent handles for all keyframes. And third one will only show it for the selected keyframes. So the next one is we can hide the value handle. Then we can display each curve's name. We can show or hide the tangent handles. Next one is the time mark display. Then we have the segment display and the snapshot display and the time group display, which we'll look into next. And the last two display the frame number and key value for each keyframe, which can be sometimes useful when we wish to have exact values and we want to see them displayed in the graph view. Okay, so now let's look at time groups. And time groups basically allows us to select a bunch of keys and assign them to a time group, like this, for instance. Let's select all these keyframes and go onto time group and create a time group from selected keys. And now we can move around this time group, and all the keys in this time group will move with it. And this can be a useful option when we want a group of keys to always move together. Okay, now we can look at some other three options we have here in the edit menu. And these are filter Euler rotation of selected channels and match keyframes of selected channels and bake keyframes. And first look at the filter Euler rotations. And filtering Euler rotations is usually required when we have flipping of objects, and because of the rotations are changing, for instance, from one frame to another more than 180 degrees. And let's just create here an example by keying the rotations and, for instance, just changing the values. And let's do this one. Now notice that nothing changes actually in the viewport, but we see in the graph view that the values are wrong and there was a 180-degree rotation in all three axes. And we have to fix this because rotations flipping like we see here usually cause problems when we are rendering with motion blur. If we use the filter Euler rotations and we select all these channels, it will fix those problems and move the keys so we don't get such flipping. Such problems usually happen when we are baking constraints or something like this. We can get this type of curves, and filtering Euler rotations usually fixes this problem. The next one is match keyframes of selected time arcs. And it's very useful when blocking animation, for instance, and we wish to make sure that all channels have keyframes at the same frames. For instance, let's take this translate Z and add a few keyframes here, here, and here. And now if we select all channels, we see that at these frames only translate Z has keyframes, and we wish to make sure that all channels have keyframes at the same frames. And let's delete, for instance, these two keyframes. And if we select now all channels and match keyframes of selected time arcs, you'll notice that whenever there was a key on any channel, it was added to all channels. So for instance, here that we added for the translate Z, it was now added to all these channels at this frame. And the same because we deleted these keyframes here and the other channels had keyframes, they were added to translate Z. So this feature is very useful when blocking poses, and we want to make sure that everything is keyed. And lastly, we have bake options, and bake option, basically we can select all the keys and just say bake, and we can choose the time range when we want to do resample, and it will set the keyframe at every frame. Another useful option is when we just want to basically create keyframes at the cycled curves. We can just do select the bake keyframes and disable these resample segments, and then we turn this cycled curve animation and into keyframe animation that we can now edit. So now we have covered the graph view. Now let's take a look at two other options we have here, and these are Dopesheet and table view. And let's look at table view first. So what table view does is that it allows us to edit values directly for each keyframe. So for instance, here is 1000 frame, and we can edit the values by just typing directly the values here. We can also edit the function for each keyframe. So right now here is Bezier, but we can change, for instance, to linear and so on. So basically we have table view for each keyframe and value. Personally, I don't use table view much. However, I do use Dopesheet quite a lot, especially when blocking out animation. So let's take a look at this. So what we see in the Dopesheet are channels, and these green boxes here represent there's a specific keyframe set at each of these frames. So this gives us a clear view where keyframes are set, and it's great for setting and blocking part of character animation where we only want to focus on timing and posing rather than how the keyframes are polished. To select keyframes here in the Dopesheet, for instance, we have selection tool, and we can just click and drag to select the keys, and then simply drag left and right to move the keys. We can also use this region tool, and this region tool, by left clicking and dragging, we define a box of selection. So any keyframe that's in this box will be selected. We also have these two handles here that we can adjust the selection. And if we left click and drag, we are just changing the selection. However, if we middle mouse button click and drag, we are moving the keys around. We also have the option to select, for instance, here the entire rows. So whatever you selected, it will select the entire row, and the same goes, for instance, the selection of entire columns. Here we are just having another button here. This is just to deselect all the keys. And here is all displayed. If you click on this one, it will select all the keys here. And then we have the ripple tool here. And what ripple tool does is basically at whatever frame we click and hold the left mouse button and then drag, all the frames, keyframes following the frame we clicked will be moved by as many frames as is indicated by this arrow. So if I release here, all these keyframes will be moved for as many frames as I had dragged. So for instance, here will be just one frame, and so on. And then we have the snap current selection to keys, which will shrink the current selection so that the side touches the minimum and maximum key selection. So for instance, if we select these keys here and just use the snap current selection to keys, it will shrink the selection so that it touches, the edges touches the keyframes. Then we have the option to completely disable the keys, and basically so they don't affect the animation, and disabled keys are shown in darker color as shown here. So we can select them, and here is the enable keys, which enables the keys back. And lastly, we have also the snap selected keys to nearest frame, which does the same as it does in the graph view, which moves any key that is between the frames to the nearest frame. So if the key is set at frame 3.2 frame, it will snap it to frame 3. And then the same as the graph view, we have a display toolbar here at the right. The first two are for the framing the timeline, and the next one is useful when we are dealing with channel groups. So let's select, for instance, the spine, right arm, and eye blinks. And right now, it's hard to separate which channel belongs to each channel group. And for instance, if you just want to work on the spine, it's hard to separate which channels belong to the spine channel group. If we click here on one line per group, we see each channel group in a separate line, and the same for the animation layers. And now it's very easy to select, for instance, all the spine keyframes or all the right arm keyframes. The next one lists back the one channel per line. And then we have to show all channel row, which is for selecting all the keyframes. And then we have just a full channel path names, the way it is displayed here in the channel list. So that's it for this video. I hope you found this tutorial useful, and see you next time.